me. Well, this is me. This is a picture of me. I'm lead tech at AHC Pacific, and what I want to try and do today is to try and convince you of a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that my job is not to write code. I'm a software developer, but that's not my job. And I'm not going to try and convince you, which Rick tried and led me in with, that writing code is unimportant. Writing code is important. I just want to convince you that it's not the most important thing that a software developer does. It's not what you were hired to do if you're a software developer. If there's any non-software developers in the audience, I'm going to try and make this kind of a bit relevant, but I'm a software developer, so this is about me. It's going to be about software development. So just to try and tell you a little bit about me and my history before we go into my main talk, and hopefully this will kind of set the scene a little bit so you can know about me. I've been a software developer for a long, long time. I first started programming at the age of 10 using these things. So the top one is a ZX Spectrum, and the bottom one is a BBC Micro. I loved these things. They were amazing. As a 10-year-old child, the ability to type something on a keyboard and have a TV screen at the time actually give something back to you, that was amazing. It was absolutely incredible. I love making things work. Incidentally, the ZX Spectrum has an amazing feature which is mind-blowing nowadays. If we look at the keyboard, you didn't actually program by typing the letters. So you wouldn't type IF. You'd actually press a key that said if on it. The reason for that is because the ZX Spectrum only had 16 kilobytes of RAM. Not megabytes, not gigabytes, 16 kilobytes of RAM. And so internally, if wasn't stored as IF, it was stored as a byte that represented IF because it was too large to store the individual letters. There was no internal storage in a ZX Spectrum. It stored everything using tape, not these backup DAT tapes that you get these days with 15 terabytes of storage. Audio tape, the type of tape you put in to listen to ABBA, is what you stored the data, well, that I put in to listen to ABBA, is what you stored things on. What you actually did was you took your mum's tape recorder and you plugged an audio cable, a 3.5mm jack from the Spectrum, into the tape recorder. You press record, and then you press save on the computer very, very quickly, otherwise you wasted a few seconds of tape. Then the other way around, you plug it in, you hit read on the Spectrum, and press play on the tape, and hope you got the timing right, otherwise you had to start all over again. I love these things. This is what I grew up on. It was incredible. And of course, because we're back in some number of decades ago, they were developed using BASIC. BASIC, beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code. Ooh, remembered it. This was an amazing programming language back then. Very, very simple. But of course, being a kid with aspirations of being a software developer, I wanted to move on from BASIC. I wanted to get into programming on desktops. So I went to learn, as a 12-year-old, C++. And failed. This did not fit my 12-year-old brain. Pointers and references and header files and null terminated strings, no. I could not get my head around this. So I started looking for an alternative. And I did what all techie script kiddies at 13 years old did. I did Visual Basic. Sorry. I made up for it in the future, but Visual Basic as a child learning to program was amazing. It is the quick ability to code something, get it up on the screen and use it. Great. I wrote everything from slot machines to my one and only claim to fame. A friend and I, back in the 90s, late 90s, we wrote an IRC client. Now, who remembers IRC? Anybody? Wow, okay, I'm surprised. That's actually a lot. So for those of you that don't know what IRC was, this is back in the days before Slack. This is back in the days before Stack Overflow, and back in the day before Reddit. This is all of those things combined. IRC was the way that geeks talked to each other. And a friend and I wrote IceChat, which was the second most popular IRC client, in Visual Basic. Yeah. IRC is pretty much non-existent now. It's been replaced by Slack and stuff, but I loved it back in the day. So being a geeky kid, obviously I went to university to study software development. I loved my course. It was incredible. I chose all of the modules that were based on coursework rather than exams because I hate exams. And what that effectively meant was that I could spend all of my time studying. Well, actually, all of my time playing games with a friend of mine. We love this absolute gem of a game called Wolfenstein Enemy Territory. I played so much of this game, embarrassingly large amount of this. And my friends and I lived together, and we spent all our time either writing code together or playing games together. And I remember saying to one of my friends, if this is what the job of a programmer is, writing code and playing games, I cannot wait to leave university and start working. So everything I've just said, hopefully that will kind of give you an idea of who I am. Probably too much of an idea of who I am. I left university and I got my first job as a professional software developer. I worked for the local government in the UK. Now, of course, being the UK and it being a local government, they had wonderful offices. 17th century, incredible. Of course, working in local government and working in IT, they put us in the 1970s Margaret Thatcher building down the road. What I did there was I did geographical information systems. So that's a fancy way of saying maps. Because the local government, they had MPs, and the MPs wanted to know about the local constituents. They wanted to know age and sex and affluence and all of these things. So we developed software that allowed them to say, okay, let's just draw an area on a map and tell me who lives there. Tell me about the census data. Tell me, what the age range of people that live here is, etc. I also worked on a really interesting project that plotted all of the brothels in my local town. Ask me about it in the pub later after a few pints. So as I was doing this job, I realized that unlike what I thought I was going to be doing when I was at university and I was playing games and writing code, I realized that I wasn't spending all of my day writing code. Some days I didn't actually write any code at all. Maybe I was a new developer. Maybe they didn't trust me. These are the things that were going on in my head. Maybe I didn't have the skills that were needed as a software developer to do the things, to write the code. What were the things that I was doing? I was configuring databases. I was configuring monitoring software. I was working on automation parameters. I was working on testing environments. I was learning libraries and frameworks that I've never even heard of before. And, of course, meetings. So many meetings. All of that stopped me getting my head into the code. The meetings just never ended. There was meetings to start off a project, meetings to end a project, meetings to discuss architecture, meetings about meetings I've just had, meetings about meetings I was going to have. Everything that kept me from getting my head down and writing code. 3 months passed, 6 months passed, and I was starting to feel really quite depressed and dismayed at this job. I was starting to feel really unproductive. I was there, hired as a software developer, and I wasn't writing code. I actually started feeling ashamed. I started feeling like I wasn't good enough, and they weren't giving me the real work. They weren't giving me the job that I'd been hired to do. I wasn't doing any real work. I actually started fearing for my job. I started thinking to myself, you hired me to write code, and I'm not writing code. I'm barely writing any code at all. And I started seeing everything that stopped me from writing code as something that had to be done quickly, something that had to be pushed out of the way so I could get back to my real job. And I actually still felt that way when I left that job, unfortunately. But things turned up for me. My next job, I started working for a multinational manufacturer. Anybody in the UK know who Corby are? Yeah? So Corby make trouser presses, which, as every good English gentleman know, is what you use to press your trousers. But they're the way you get the creases in the right place in your trousers. So proper men's trousers, they have a crease down the front. I'm not wearing them today, but they have a crease down the front. And the way you get that is you put them in the trouser press, and it uses steam and pressure to crease them. Very English. I haven't seen a single one of these in Australia. So I worked for this company, and I worked on a software product that ran their warehousing, stock, and order management system. And I actually built that system from scratch, alone. And when I say alone, I actually literally mean alone. I was the only software developer in this entire company. Unlike the last job, where I had a team of people around me, I didn't have anybody. I was entirely alone. But I had a great mentor. This mentor was not a software developer. This mentor didn't teach me how to write code, but he taught me how to be a better software developer. He was the operations director. He was a mechanical engineer by trade. And he used what he knew, the techniques of mechanical engineering, the techniques of operations, in the creation of the software. So he didn't teach me how to write better code. He taught me how to write better software. I learned a lot on this job. Absolute amazing amount of stuff. He taught me how to organize my day, how to spend less time doing the things I didn't want to do and more time doing the things I did want to do. He taught me how to stay productive. Best tip I can ever give anybody on productivity: turn your email notifications off. You do not need to get that email. If it's important, they'll phone you. That's why the phone was invented. Turn your email notifications off. He taught me how to organize my to-do list. When you feel like you've got 1,000,001 things to do, we were building a software product that ran an entire multinational business, and we did it in 6 months. And we did that by organizing everything we were going to do. By looking at a large problem and breaking it down, working out how to use reusable bits of technology, reusable bits of code, and use that in various places, which is all his techniques from mechanical engineering. And that's what we used to write the software. So, the other thing he did, clicky. Good. The other thing he did is he actually made me do the job that I was writing the software for. So, I was actually there in my scruffs in the warehouse, booking in stock that had arrived from the warehouse in China. I was there scanning the stuff out onto the delivery lorries. I was there answering the phone to the people whose delivery hadn't arrived and explaining to them why. I did stock take audits. I placed orders for the factory in China. I did all of the jobs that the software was meant to do. It was around this time that I started having an epiphany about the job I talked about previously. I started to see the benefits of everything that they were doing. Everything that my mentor was showing me was about improving the software that we built. It was about making sure the software added more value. It was about making sure that the business problems were solved. Making sure that the end users had a better solution for the problems that they were having. And then I realized something. I was being paid to solve problems. I wasn't being paid to write code. I was being paid to solve problems. And that code is the tool that you use to solve the problems. It isn't the crux of everything. Just as a carpenter isn't hired as somebody that knows how to use a hammer, he's hired as somebody that knows how to build a cabinet. As a software developer, I was hired to solve problems, and code was my hammer. You have to know the problems you're solving. You have to know the troubles that the people go through that you're trying to solve in order to solve their problems effectively. You have to know what the value proposition of what you're building is in order to provide the best value. I'm going to say that again. Software engineers, your job is not to write code, it's to solve business problems. and provide value to end users. In fact, unless we're talking about open source code, I'd actually get rid of that bottom line, because ultimately providing value to end users is solving a business problem. But not everybody lives in the wonderful world of open source, so I left it in there. As an aside, the company that I just talked about, because I'm going through a visa application at the moment to hopefully stay in this wonderful country, I spoke to him about 3 or 4 months ago. This software is still being used. Almost a decade later, it's still being used, which is amazing to me. How often does software get used that often? It probably shouldn't be, but it is. It was written by a single developer, so hopefully it's in a completely different scenario. So, hopefully you've all had time to think about that. My current job. I got the cool offices, eventually. So, working in the UK, I actually work for the same company now that I work for in the UK, but I've moved to Australia. I got the cool offices, but of course, working in IT, in the gutter. I can just about see sky. If I get close and I look up, I can see the sky. So what I do now is I do complex financial models. We work with financial institutions, banks, superannuation funds, investment advisors, investment funds, etc. And this is where I have a little bit of a confession. This is the slide that I introduced myself with. And it's actually got a deliberate mistake on it, because I didn't want to lose anyone before we started. My actual job title is Lead Technical Consultant. And I know that that has quite a loaded feeling against it, the word consultant, but this is what people think of when they think of consultants. They think of people smiling in suits. They think of people looking at computers, smiling. Consultants do a lot of smiling. They think of people looking at flip charts and pointing at them. If you really want to laugh, just Google consultants and hit image. It's really good fun. But in my defense, the reason why I have that in my job title is because I like doing what I'm doing now. I like talking and I like listening. I like speaking to people and I like learning about them. I like learning about the problems they have. And I like thinking about ways we can help them. That's the only reason why I have that word in my job title. And it wasn't really until I had this particular job where I realized that that's the sort of thing I enjoy. Previous to this, I was always of the advocate of, oh, the phone is ringing, somebody else will get it. That's really not what I'm like now. I actually actively enjoy speaking to people. Just before this meetup, I was speaking to a client up the road, and I spent an hour with them, and I really enjoyed it. It's really tiring, but I really enjoyed it. Now, I just want to talk about some of the things that I said earlier on were the part of the job of a software developer, but maybe not writing code. So this is kind of what I like to think of. I don't want to unstress how important code is. Code is important. You can't do the job without code, just as the carpenter can't do their job without a hammer. But I just want to highlight that these things we do before we write the code and these things we do after we write the code are just as important, and depending on your bent, maybe even slightly more important than the code itself. A decent part of the job that I do now is doing these things on the left and the right and not the middle. I still do a lot of writing code because I really, really enjoy it. But I see that the value that I add, and that's why the title of my talk is my job as a software developer is not to write code. I really see the value of what I add to the business is more in these things at the start and the end. So let's just go through some of the things, and we'll start off with the things at the start first. So these are the things we do before we write code. Communications. So don't underestimate the value of having somebody in a meeting with a client before you start the project. Having a technical person there is so valuable. It sets everything off on the right foot. Nobody's got any miscommunications. Answers questions right at the start. How are we doing this? What's the deliverable? What form is it going to take? There's so many times where we've won work purely because we had a technical person there speaking to the client at the start. Or maybe it was just because there was the confidence that We knew we could answer the questions. Even if we didn't answer them there and then, the fact that we had somebody knowledgeable in the room that could say, yeah, I understand exactly the issue you've got, I'll get back to you. And I would. And also, frankly, I'm a huge show-off. I don't think I'd be stood in front of you if I wasn't. I'm really proud of what we produce as a company. I'm really proud of the things that we make. And I'm paid to go and show that off. I am a huge show-off, and I'm paid to do it. That's a really amazing part of my job. Thinking. Thinking is important. Critical thinking. The ability to work through a problem, the ability to think about a solution, but also question everything. Don't always think, as software developers, we often have the prejudice that we don't shake our views easily. And for a lot of people, that's true. I always try and make sure that I question my views. Seek to test your own views, because you never know if you're right or not. Seek for evidence. Design and architecture. Solving the problem by spending more time thinking so you can write less code is always the preferable option. You've got less to maintain, you've got the solution closer to the reality. It's always the preferable solution. Design and architect doesn't have to be some massive UML diagram that's shared around the whole organization. It can just be you in a chair thinking about the solution. In your heads, thinking about it. Whatever it takes, just whatever it takes to just think about the solution. So those are the things we do before we write code. Then we write the code, and then we think about what we do afterwards. So documentation. I don't necessarily always mean documenting your code. Documenting your code is important, but document the business processes, document the decisions you made and why you made them. How do you know when you come back in 6 months why you made a particular decision if you haven't documented it? You might redo work. And talking about code documentation, code is read 10 times more than it's written. Think about that for a minute. Do yourself a favor, because you're probably going to be the person that comes back to this in 18 months and looks at the code and wonders what it does. Do yourself a favor and document it. Testing. The fuck it, ship it mentality doesn't work. It really doesn't. Technical debt is a major, major issue in our industry. Every day we deal with it. Don't sacrifice doing it right for doing it fast. Companies that make you do that are not somewhere you should be working. You should be proud of what you do. You should be proud of what you produce. Make sure it's right. And the way we make sure it's right is testing. Monitoring and testing hypotheses. How do we know if we're doing our job well if we don't measure it? How do we know when we finished our job if we don't measure it? A small change that you make can have a huge impact. If you don't measure, monitor, and test that, how do you know? A/B testing, analytics, everything you can do to validate your hypothesis. Learning, experimenting, and exploring. So the technical landscape is always changing. There's always some new unicorn poop.js or whatever. There's always something new to learn. And it's always hard to keep up with that. I honestly believe it's not as important as some people, some recruiters might make you feel that it's important to keep up to date. But think about it from your point of view. If you learn something new and you can solve the problem you're doing now better, everybody wins. There's no downside to learning new things. There's no downside to experimenting, as long as you don't experiment in production. Ask me how I know. I don't refuse to hire somebody because they don't know the latest framework. A good developer can always learn the framework. And having proof that you've tried new things, that you've experimented, that's good enough. Any company that doesn't encourage you to learn, experiment, and grow, work somewhere else. It's not worth your time. Last month, Peter Wilson, is Peter in? I've not seen him. No. He stood here and he talked about code reviews, and he said that he had a guilty secret that he enjoyed code reviews. I don't think that should be a guilty secret. I think it should be a desire that we all have to look at other people's code. We can always learn from other people, and we can always make other people better by discussing. It shouldn't be a guilty secret. It should be an open wish that you should want to do code reviews. I really enjoy code reviews. I really enjoy looking at somebody else's code. I always learn something new. And you're never as clever as you think you are. Somebody else always knows better than you. So that's kind of the things that I see as things outside of the actual writing of code that it's important. Again, not to say that coding itself isn't important. We can have this discussion in the pub afterwards. Really, please have this discussion with me. This is all something that I've been thinking about for a while, and it's really good to discuss with people. So please, if you disagree with me, really speak to me about it. I want to leave you with a quote. This is by a guy called Michael J. Corrin. Great thinker in terms of the future of software development. What he says is, in the future, everyone will be a software engineer, and barely anyone will know how to code. To me, that quote means that we don't really know how the technical landscape is going to change. We don't really know what future advances there are going to be there in terms of how code is written. Maybe in 20 years' time, AI is going to be this whole amazing thing that means nobody writes code anymore. But the analysis of what problems exist, the thinking of solutions of how to solve those problems, that will always need to be done. Developers, I know you think you were hired to write code, but you weren't. You were hired to solve problems, and code is just the tool that you use to solve the problems. Technical interviews are all geared up for you to prove how well you can write code, but that's not important. I'm sure you write really awesome code, but it's not your job. Forgive me a small indulgence. I really loved how well that looked on the screen, so I figured I'd do one myself. My worth as a software engineer is not in how well I write code. It's in my ability to solve problems and provide value to end users. Thank you.
Get back!